Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, welcoming you to our second panel of our conference, The World at a Crossroad, 2 months into the Biden administration. The topic of the second panel, which we're about to begin, is the strategic crisis facing the human race. And this is extremely timely, given events of the last days, as the issue confronting all mankind was made abundantly clear that we're facing a crisis of war or peace, a choice between an anti-human global banker's dictatorship or peaceful cooperation and economic development, and between unilateralism backed by military power to enforce the so-called rules-based order, or a dialogue of civilizations in which the sovereignty of all states is respected by all. By events of the last couple of days, I'm referring to the first encounter between the top officials in the Biden administration and the People's Republic of China, which took place in Anchorage, Alaska, and had some moments of tension. It still remains to be seen what comes out of the meeting, but also the very unfortunate remark by President Biden, in which he appeared to be agreeing with the commentator that President Putin of Russia is a killer. While Putin responds somewhat playfully, he also made a very serious proposal that there be an immediate dialogue, person to person, between President Putin and President Biden. And this goes to what Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute has been calling for since the beginning of last year, this kind of personal diplomacy of leaders of the great nations. This is in the tradition of the call by Lyndon LaRouche for a four-power agreement between the United States, China, Russia, and India, because these are the four countries that have the economic power and the military power to stand up against the geopolitical maneuvers of the financial empire of the City of London and Wall Street, and at the same time overcome the effects of neoliberalism, which has put the world financial system in an extremely fragile and dangerous place. So it's absolutely appropriate that our keynote will come from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who has dedicated many, many decades to building the idea of a dialogue of cultures as the basis for a new paradigm. So Helga?
Thank you. I greet you wherever you are. And let me just point to the obvious fact that anybody who looks at the world right now realizes that we are confronted with a whole number of existential crises, each of which can harm the human population tremendously by the millions of people. One is obviously the pandemic, which is not under control. Then we have a famine of biblical dimensions, as David Beasley from the World Food Program keeps emphasizing, with an absolutely horrendous situation in Yemen, in Syria, in many African countries. We are confronted with the potential of a financial collapse much, much beyond what we saw in 2008. And naturally, of the biggest concern sometimes is really the potential, of a confrontation, which is, coming from the fact that the United States, the British government, NATO have been increasingly talking about Russia and China as an adversary, as a competitor, and even as an enemy. And, in my best knowledge, and I'm not relying on sources, on secondary sources, but from my own experience of discussions with leaders from Russia, from China, from European countries, and patriotic Americans, this adversary relationship must be overcome, because in the time and age of thermonuclear weapons, any idea that you can start a limited nuclear war or a limited conventional war, which has the potential of using low-yield nuclear weapons, which sort of blur the difference between conventional and nuclear weapons, any such idea has the potential of getting out of control. And if you look at the recent months, where many times you had US or NATO jets being in conflict with Russian jets or Chinese jets. So when you actually come to the conclusion that the maintenance of peace is depending on the ability of a pilot to divert such a possible collision, then peace is in grave danger. Now, this has all very deep reasons. We addressed some of them in the previous panel. But I think that what is really needed is to rethink, can humanity not give itself an order which guarantees the long-time survivability of the entire human species? Now, I personally think that the idea of the globalization of NATO, of shifting the focus to the Indo-Pacific, is a policy which has incredible dangers and should not continue. The idea of globalization of NATO would mean an encirclement containment policy against Russia and China, which will be met with resistance. And so I tend to agree with a recent statement by a French general called General Grégoire Diamantidis, who represents a think tank called Cercle de Réflexion Interarmée. And he wrote an open letter to the General Secretary of NATO, Stoltenberg, by saying that NATO right now is on the course of a train wreck and that it should be dissolved because the only purpose right now is to drive a wedge between the Europeans and Russia, and basically depriving member states more and more of having a say in the policy of NATO by step developing a world government kind of control. Now, I personally think, and we have said this many times in the past, NATO lost its raison d'etre in 91. It should have been dissolved. And, on the other side, security concerns are serious and should be taken into account. But therefore, I think we need a new security architecture, and that should be part of a discussion, because if you just continue the way things are going now, we are in great danger of losing the entire civilization, because if it ever would come to one nuclear weapon being used, I believe that those experts are right who say that it's the logic of nuclear weapons as compared to conventional weapons that all of those weapons would be used, and that would be the end of civilization. So what we are proposing instead is, in light of all of these existential threats to humanity, must be found a new conception, a new paradigm, how nations can work together. And in my view, one of the best ideas for that has come from Nicolaus of Cues, who was a thinker of the 15th century, but he developed a methodology which is absolutely applicable for today, which is the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. If you apply that conception to the idea of a dynamically developing development of all nations, sort of what the Chinese are calling the shared humanity for the future of mankind, based on a win-win cooperation among sovereign states who respect the different social systems and who work together for the benefit of the one humanity. The coincidence of opposites is the idea that human reason can find a unity which is on a higher level than the many. The one has a higher power than the many. And if you regard this, as Nicolaus of Cues did, not as a static concept, but as a sort of contrapuntally, fugally developing concept where each participating nation and state is searching and trying to further the benefit and the well-being of the other, so that you have a sort of a concordance in the macrocosm by the maximum development of all microcosms. Now, while that seems to be a utopian conception for some people, it is actually the only way how humanity can continuously work together. And I think that we want to use the Schiller Institute forums as a platform where these kinds of ideas are being discussed. And therefore, I don't want to make a very long speech, but only introductory remarks. I therefore want to welcome the speakers on this panel, and I hope that these ideas can find a fruitful dialogue and get furthered for the sake of all of humanity.
Thank you, Helga. The panel will proceed in two parts, and we'll begin now with well, let me just introduce who's on the panel, and then we'll begin with the speeches. Ambassador Ping Huang, the Consul General of the Consulate of the People's Republic of China in New York, will speak, and then Alexi Boguslavskiy, who is the first secretary from the Russian Federation mission to the United Nations. He'll be followed by Dr. Bouthaina Shaaban, who's a political and media advisor to the Syrian presidency. And then finally, Dr. William Happer, a retired professor from Princeton University, who served on the U.S. National Security Council. So let's begin with Ambassador Huang, the Consul General of the Consulate of the People's Republic of China. Welcome to our conference, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, President LaRouche. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to join this video conference hosted by Schiller Institute. The past year was marked by the onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic. Nearly 120 million people were infected, and more than 2.6 million people lost their lives. The global economy was mired in deep recession. At present, the world has achieved initial progress in fighting COVID-19, but the pandemic is still far from over, and the economic recovery has a long way to go. Just like the theme of this conference, the world is indeed at a crossroad. It is a critical time for all countries to unite and cooperate to meet challenges together. Bearing 20% of the world population, being a key player in COVID vaccine R&D and production, and a strong supporter of international cooperation, China is the essential member of the human society in the most pressing task of containing the pandemic. It is, in the meantime, contributing over 30% to world economic growth for the past 10 years in a row. China was the only major economy that achieved positive growth last year. So stabilizing and reviving global economy cannot do without China either. Regrettably, in recent years, China and the Communist Party of China, which is CPC, have been increasingly demonized, stereotyped, or even labeled by some Western politicians and the media. Therefore, it's essentially important for the world to understand and perceive China in a true and objective way. Here, I wish to share with you some thoughts regarding China, the Chinese government, and its ruling party. Histories make man wise. When we look back to China's history, especially in the early 20th century, China was then one of the poorest countries, and its people lived in misery due to domestic turmoil and foreign aggression. It was at that time, under the domestic and international movement, the CPC was born in 1921. In its 100-year history, the CPC has led Chinese people accomplish world-renowned achievements in establishing and building a new China, and made great contributions to the world peace and prosperity. First, we are not ruling in an authoritative way. but always uphold the people's democracy. What kind of system a country chooses is determined by the country's nature and the reality. The US has its American-style democracy, and China has a Chinese-style democracy. Just copying other countries may not work. China's democratic political system was born only after the Western democratic model failed to save China. It's a result of the long-term development and evolution on the basis of China's historical heritage, cultural tradition, and economic and social practice. The socialist democracy of China upholds a system of people's congresses, multi-party cooperation and consultation, and law-based governance. The party is from the people, the government is for the people, and the country is run by the people. That is our philosophy. According to the Harvard University survey, the Chinese people's satisfaction with the central government is as high as 93.1%, which finally fully proves that we enjoy broad support from the people. No attempt to smear China's social system would get anywhere. Second, we never disregard human rights, but always put people first. Based on China's reality, we take the rights of subsistence and development as the basic human rights. At the same time, we strive for comprehensive and coordinated development of economic and social rights, as well as civil and political rights. Over the past 70 plus years, since the founding of the People's Republic of China, China's per capita GDP has risen from less than $30 to over 10,000 US dollars. More than 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. I think that's the greatest achievement of human rights protection. The number of people covered by the basic medical care insurance reached 1.3 billion. Places inhabited by ethnic minorities have also achieved long-term development. In the past 60 years and more, Xinjiang's per capita GDP grew by nearly 40 times, and its average life expectancy increased from 30 to 72. The rights of all ethnic minority groups, including way of life and freedom of religious belief, are fully guaranteed and respected. China's human rights development achievements can stand the test of history and time. Third, we do not stand still, but constantly seek to improve. In the past decades, we have always put forward and adjusted development strategies in a timely manner according to changes in the situation. From focusing on the central task of economic construction, take development as a top priority, to scientific outlook on development and the overall plan for promoting all-round economic, political, cultural, social, and ecological progress. Each time, the perfection and innovation of our development philosophy has led China to new development levels. Facing new changes in the current situation, we have put forward the new development concept of innovation, coordination, green, openness, and sharing. It will enable China to achieve higher quality and more sustainable development in the future. For example, in the field of green development, China's carbon intensity reduced by 48.1% compared with the year 2005. Non-fossil fuel took up to 15.3% in energy consumption, and the air and water quality of nearly all major cities improved significantly due to concerted actions. Fourth, we do not advocate China first, but always embrace win-win cooperation. Win-win cooperation has been a natural outcome of China's reform and opening up policy. It is also the basic principle of China's diplomacy. China's development is not just about delivering benefits for its own people, but also about contributing to the development of the world. China has become the largest trading partner of nearly 130 countries and regions, with imports accounting for 11% of the world's total. China is also one of the economies with the highest degree of openness and the greatest improvement in the business environment in the world. We have signed 205 cooperation documents for the joint building of the Belt and Road Initiative with 171 countries and international organizations. The total volume of goods trade with those countries have exceeded 7.8 trillion US dollars, and the direct investment has exceeded 110 billion US dollars. Finally, we are not narrow-minded nationalists, but always care about the common destiny of mankind. We help developing countries with sincerity and good faith, and actively carry out foreign aid and mutually beneficial cooperation. We uphold multilateralism, support the UN, and work together with Russia, US, and other related parties in solving various regional hotspot issues. In the face of the pandemic, we have provided assistance to more than 150 countries and 13 international organizations, donated COVID vaccines to 69 developing countries in urgent need, and exported vaccines to 43 countries. In the area of globalization, drawing lines with ideology and forming exclusive cliques targeting specific countries is unpopular and has no way out. China's vision and actions are well witnessed and recognized by the world. China has made great development achievements, but it remains a developing country. Some prominent problems of unbalanced and inadequate development have not been solved. There are still large disparities in development between rural and urban areas, between regions, and in income distribution. And the people are still facing difficulties in employment, education, medical care, housing, and pensions. In the future, China will adhere to its 14th five-year plan for national economic and social development and the long-range objectives through the year 2035, improve the quality and efficiency of economic development to better meet the needs of the people. Meanwhile, China is fostering a new development paradigm featuring dual circulations, with domestic circulation as the mainstay and domestic and international circulations reinforcing each other and advancing opening up at the higher level. This will create more opportunities for cooperation between China and other countries. Ladies and gentlemen, both China and the US are major countries of the world. We gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation. The current China-US relations are at a very important juncture. On this Lunar New Year's Eve, President Xi and President Biden had their first telephone call, which sent a positive signal to the world that the two major countries are committed to maintaining communication, enhancing understanding, and focusing on cooperation. Acting on the spirit of the telephone conversation, China held a high-level strategic dialogue with the US in Alaska. The two sides exchanged views candidly on various issues. Here, I would like to share some views on China-US relations in the next stage. First, we need to strengthen mutual understanding. The fundamental goal of China's development is for Chinese people to live a better life. No one is in the position to deny the Chinese people their right to realize their own dreams. China adheres to the path of peaceful development and has no intention of challenging or replacing the US. We hope that the US can view China and its intention objectively and maintain the correct direction of our bilateral relationship. Second, we need to manage differences properly. It is only natural for our two countries to have differences. What is crucial is to properly manage them and not allow our relations to be defined by disagreements. Both parties should pay particular attention to respecting each other's core interests and major concerns. The US should stop interfering in issues involving China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, such as issues on Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet. Third, we need to focus on cooperation, from counterterrorism and non-proliferation to responding to the financial crisis and combating transnational crimes. The areas where China and the US need and could cooperate are constantly expanding. At present, we have a lot of room for cooperation in areas such as pandemic control, economic recovery, and climate change. In fact, the overwhelming majority of American businesses in China have said they see great profits and immense opportunities in China, so they intend to stay. This serves as a lively example of the two people's will to enhance cooperation. Fourth, we need to resume normal exchanges. People-to-people exchanges are the foundation for bilateral relations. Exchanges will enhance mutual understanding and trust. Both sides should encourage the people of the two countries to carry out exchanges and cooperations in various fields such as education, science and technology, culture, sports, and youth. We also hope the Schiller Institute and other think tanks and organizations to continue their efforts to promote the overall relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, at the crossroads of history, the future of human society ultimately depends on our choices. Conflicts and confrontation cannot lead mankind to a bright future. Peace and development remains the pursuit of most people in the world. Facing the thorny road ahead, we all should have responsibilities. We should move in the same direction, follow the expectations of the people, and join hands to lead the human society, strive against the headwind, and usher in a brighter world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Huang, for your comments. We move on now to our next speaker, who is Alexi Boguslavskiy, who is the first secretary from the Russian Federation mission to the United Nations in New York. Alexi, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to participate in the conference of the Schiller Institute. To begin with, I would like to provide several comments on the very topic of the conference about 2 months of Biden administration. I think at least now it's difficult to draw any conclusion over this period of time. In the foreign policy and even in domestic policies, what is happening now, I think, is not a surprise to anyone. In general, President Biden began by fulfilling his campaign promises. The US has returned to the climate agreement, took rather cautious steps in the direction of Iran. However, it's probably too early to talk about the prospects of the US early return to the nuclear deal. As of Syria, Middle East, and the DPRK, I think there is nothing much known yet. Unfortunately, what remains constant for now is rather unfriendly rhetoric towards Russia. We all heard about what American president said about Russian president literally this week. I think from the point of view of the norms of political ethics, it is somewhere beyond reasonable. At the same time, the Russian leadership does not feel such deep emotions about the United States. We are ready for a constructive dialogue on the issues where it is possible, and I would like to underscore where it is needed. That is why we are prioritizing our cooperation in the United Nations. In terms of the daily routine in the UN or its Security Council, I can say that nothing concrete has changed over the past 2 months, well, except for the American permanent representative to the United Nations. In general, it must be said that here in the UN, on most of the political issues, we can reach a consensus with others. Yes, there are several issues that divide us. They are very good known to the whole world, but it is only a very small fraction of issues that are being discussed here in the United Nations. In general, lately many experts or analysts, political analytics like to talk about cracks in the multilateralism. In our opinion, it is too early to bury it since, in fact, it has not yet been born. We are only in the early stages of its creation. It may take years and maybe decades for true multilateralism to prevail on our planet. New centers of power, political and economical, are only gaining their independent voice. And in the United Nations, and the United Nations is at the center of these efforts. Sure, like principles that lay in the foundation of the United Nations and that are enshrined in the UN Charter are sound even more relevant as compared to the time when the United Nations were created 75 years ago. Non-interference in internal affairs, peaceful settlement of disputes, respect for the right of people to independently determine their future. Hardly anyone can abandon these principles. And there is no alternative to the UN itself. There is no other such global and universal platform where issues of war and peace, socio-economic development, protection of human rights, and many other important topics for all the countries of the world are being discussed. The global problems that the UN is dealing with on a daily basis, like international terrorism, drug trafficking, cybercrime, climate change, have been supplemented this year with this new dangerous threat, the coronavirus pandemic. It should be admitted that it has caught everyone, both states and international structures and organizations, by surprise. But despite all the difficulties, the main international structures seems to have passed this stress test quite successfully. Of course, the United Nations is not perfect, but because the world itself is not perfect, it is becoming more and more difficult to respond to diversified global problems from year to year. All the more when some international players continue to claim their dominance or consider their values to be universal. Unfortunately, some countries and quite powerful countries are trying to replace our cooperation in the World Organization by introducing concepts like a rules-based world order. It is creating coalitions of interest to replace real and genuine international cooperation. And it's not good. The world is tired of dividing lines, divisions into friends and foes. In the face of the pandemic that has hit our planet, people are demanding increased comprehensive mutual assistance and cooperation. I think, in other words, the goals formulated 75 years ago when the United Nations were created are becoming more and more relevant. In parallel, of course, we must think about the reforms of existing institutions. And here the United Nations is a very organization in need of constant renewal. And its most important body, the Security Council, of course, also needs reforming. Increasing the representation of the developing countries of the world, eliminating the imbalances in which the collective West ensures its dominance, should go hand in hand with maintaining efficiency and the ability to quickly respond to emerging challenges. The United Nations remains the uncontested universal global forum for the continuous open and honest dialogue in order to create a more sustainable and just architecture of international relations. And I would like to reassure you that this understanding is shared by the vast majority of the countries of the world. And our faith in the future mission of the United Nations, in the future of its service for the whole humanity is not weakening. And in conclusion, I'd like to recall what President John Quincy Adams said almost 200 years ago. It was kind of a warning that America should not go abroad in search of monsters to be destroyed. I think if this promise will be fulfilled and if it will stop doing so, the whole world will probably become more secure and safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Boguslavskiy, and thank you for reminding us of those wise words from John Quincy Adams. I think not too many Americans remember them. I want to remind people that you can send questions to questions@schillerinstitute.org. That is questions@schillerinstitute.org. We have a couple more speakers, and we'll have a Q&A section before we move on to the second part of the panel. Our next speaker is someone we heard from back in June 2016, who gave a very moving presentation about the situation in Syria at that time. This is Dr. Shaaban, who is a political and media advisor to the Syrian presidency.
I would like first to thank Helga LaRouche and all of you for inviting me to speak to this very important conference, with which I find many points in common to talk about. As our topic is the strategic crisis facing the human race, I would like to start with the interim national security strategic guidance that was put by President Biden in March 2021. First, to clarify where this new American administration is going and what are our expectations, or how do we read this guidance as people who are always subject of American policies rather than participants in formulating world policy. The strategic guidance put by President Biden, and I'm referring to this one, for those of you who haven't read it, starts from the concept of Western supremacy. What President Biden stresses is the American alliance and partnership with Europe or with NATO. And what he tries to encourage is to invite countries in the world to have a world NATO instead of just a transatlantic NATO. Now, the issue here is that the strategic guidance considers this bloc of NATO's countries, are the ones who promote democracy, who acknowledge human rights, and who should teach the world how to have similar systems. Anyone or any country who doesn't fit into this criteria is considered either an autocrat or an aggressor, including Russia and China. Those are, according to this guidance, autocratic system. And they constitute a threat to this democracy. So here is the problem, that there is a number of countries who formulate an alliance, and who consider themselves to hold the superior value in the world, by the way, linked with interest. Always when they speak about values, they speak about also achieving American interests and promoting American values. So those countries are the ones who have or who possess these values, and anyone who who joins them becomes a part of this alliance and partnership, and anyone who doesn't or who has a different idea of governance or different way of life is considered either an autocrat or an aggressor. And the other threat that comes to the mind of this group of countries is technology, is the rise of China, which seems to be an obsession in this guidance, how to stop the rise of China. The problem I see here is that we are not looking, or they are not looking in this guidance, at the world as human community. They are looking at the white supremacist and other countries who should act as these white supremacists under the name of democracy and human rights, whatever you call it. Now, as a Syrian woman who lived through 10 years of war in Syria, I find this logic extremely dangerous, particularly as I know and as we experienced that the democracy they talk about is only to make our countries satellite states to their countries, which means there's no sense of equality or human brotherhood between their countries and our country. The logic I hear from China and Russia is a logic that says prosperity should prevail for all. We should fight poverty, for example. That's what the Chinese say, poverty undo. Poverty in China, but we should fight poverty everywhere else in the world, because we live in one world. We should share its resources and we should act together for its prosperity. In the case of Syria, the Western calls for democracy and freedom that was really that caused the entry of hundreds of thousands of terrorists into our country, that caused the destruction of our schools, of our infrastructure. All these calls knocked our country 100 years backwards. And from my point of view, as a Syrian woman who always lived in this land and will always live on this land, no matter what, I can tell you that the reason for this war on Syria is that Syria has an independent political mind and an independent political decision. And this is not welcome at all by these circles who want the whole world to be a copy of what they think, of what they want. And no one has the right to have, for example, a different democracy, or a different way of life, or a different culture that leads to things that we probably appreciate here in Syria, where other people appreciate different things. So the issue I found with this strategy is that it left no room to the variety of human nature, to the variety of human culture, to the variety of human likings and dislikings. So Syria, for example, in 2010 had the fourth developing economy in the world, and now they destroyed our economy, they destroyed our schools, they destroyed our way of life, they destroyed our identity through a flood of terrorism that came through Turkey, of course, into our country. And the issue is that I'm sure all of you hear that the United States is in the northeast of Syria in order to fight ISIL and in order to fight terrorism. Now, if we are fighting terrorism, which we are definitely, because it's our interest and it's our life to live free of terrorism, and if they are here to fight terrorism, why can't we join forces together to fight terrorism? I tell you, the United States and the allied forces with them in Syria are here to protect the terrorists. And this is what they had been doing. If it were not for the presence of the United States forces in the Tanif, and if it were not for their military attack against our forces, we would have liberated the entire Syrian soil from terrorism. The other objective for them is to prevent any relation between Iraq and Syria, because the relation between Iraq and Syria is extremely vital for the Syrian people and for the Iraqi people. So what I would like to say is that the world today is facing a crisis that the new American administration is focusing on alliances and partnership in the face of China and Russia, and in the face of any country who dares be different from their democratic way of life, who dares have their own democracy, who dares have their own independent resources. Otherwise, how on earth could the US justify looting our oil and our wheat and preventing our people from our natural resources? Here I come to the second problem in the strategy, in the guidance to this strategy, which is the difference between what is being coined in language and the practices on the ground. The practices on the ground is that this Western bloc, as Biden referred to it, with its partners and its alliances, do not see us as people. They see our oil, they see our wheat, they see our geographic position, but they do not care at all what kind of life we live, what kind of problems they create for us. My conclusion from this is that we need a different paradigm for the future of humanity. And I can see that China and Russia and Iran and Syria and Venezuela and Schiller Institute and all of you who believe in the dignity of the human self and in the independence and in the sovereignty of every state in the world, big or small, are working for this brotherhood among all countries in the world, with no superior and inferior, with no people who want to say one size fits all. No, one size does not fit all. We come from a different culture, we have a different point of view, we like to build our future according to what we want, we enjoy, we appreciate. This is what would save the world, the acknowledgement that God created all of us in different places, with different cultures, with different languages, but only to enjoy the differences, not to give a carte blanche for those who believe they are superior to others, as they did with indigenous civilizations, which were wiped out by them and which caused a huge, horrible loss to human history and to human wealth and to human education and to human civilization. I hope we will join forces together, East and people in West, in order to create a world where people feel respected and where people feel that their different culture is an asset rather than something to be punished or something to be eroded if they can. I thank you for inviting me to this conference, and I truly hope that we could be active in joining partnership that would ensure a much better future for the world, where no supremacy, no occupation, no terrorism exists. Thank you very much.